Greetings and welcome to TrainSignal. You're watching Plan, Install, Configure, and Manage Client Access. It's a primary topic for the 70-341 Core Solutions exam with Exchange 2013. The subtopic we'll be discussing in this lesson is Plan and Configure Namespaces and Client Services. Under Plan and Configure Namespaces and Client Services, this objective may include, but is not limited to, design namespaces for client connectivity, configure URLs, plan for certificates, implement auto-discovery for a given namespace, and configure authentication methods. The scenario for this one might look familiar to you. It was the same scenario we used for the Exchange 2013 administration course with a company named SpyTech Prime. They're a spy technology surveillance company. They provide gadgets and gizmos aplenty. Now their problem is they want secure accessibility for their Exchange environment. And so they know they can't use the self-signed certs that have been given to them when they install Exchange. They know they need to implement a solid SAN cert from a certificate authority for secure socket layer CAS connectivity. Now I know that's a mouthful, so not to worry. We're going to explain all of the little acronyms there, and we'll explain the reasons why they need to go in a certain direction, and why our encouragement will be that they make decisions that will make it easier for their Exchange deployment. Okay, so let's get started. Let's start with a discussion of namespaces. Now there's quite a bit written actually when it comes to namespaces, and you'll find that there's not one, but two different articles on working with namespaces at the end of the lesson in the additional research. Why so much focus on namespaces? Well, because the namespace is actually just part of the puzzle. You have to first decide on your namespace, and then you go forward and you implement those namespaces internally with your DNS, externally with your DNS. You have to keep this in mind when it comes to certificates. So namespaces, well, they're a big deal. They're not hard to figure out, though, once you understand what you're going for and matching the namespaces up to your idea and your design, as well as what your actual physical deployment looks like. But what is a namespace? It's a logical structure represented by a DNS domain name. That's all it is. We know domain names are things like companyname.com, and so if you wanted to have a namespace for accessing Outlook web app, you might have it be oa.companyname.com or mail.companyname.com. And ultimately, those namespaces will link back to services on the back end, as far as whether or not it's imap.companyname.com for IMAP connectivity or pop.companyname.com. So all of those different namespaces need to be thought out. And then it's more than just making sure you have it in DNS, externally and internally, but you also have to consider whether or not you're going with split DNS, where you might have a different name internally than you use externally. And certainly you need to consider certificates, making sure that you have the appropriate names represented in the certificates themselves so that clients can connect without the annoying red messages that come up and little pop-ups that say that the certificate is not correct for the site. Now, there are different organizational models for namespace design, and we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of this. There's really no point in over-focusing on this. It's important that you read the articles at the end of the lesson to really get the full grasp of this. But the easiest model is the single physical site with a single namespace, like mail.exchangeexchange.com. Then you might have single namespaces with multiple sites or proxy sites. You might use regional namespaces, and then you might use multiple forest namespaces. Now, going back up to the top, if we look at this and we look at the single physical site, you might have a centralized data center. And in that case, all of the Exchange servers are located within that physical site, the single physical site. And so a single namespace would work just fine. With that model, you don't have too many DNS records to worry about. You have fewer certificates to worry about and manage. You have only one URL for clients to worry about. But keep in mind, that single physical site, that centralized data center solution, well, it doesn't support site resilience. So in that case, you have to think about what is your site resilient plan. Now, you might not have one, and that's okay. It's up to you and it's up to your budget. But each model carries with it different pros and cons. One of the cons in this case is that there's no site resilience. Now, then there's the single namespace where you might use a proxy site. That's where only one site has that internet-facing client access server. With this model, again, you're configuring fewer DNS records, you're not dealing with all of the certificates that are involved in larger deployments. The client computers still only use one external URL. However, because all of your sites, with the exception of the one, do not contain the internet-facing CAS server, your end users will access their mailboxes through a proxy. Now, as far as using a single namespace where you have a multiple site solution, that's where you might have more than one internet-facing CAS server. And so in that case, maybe each site has its own client access server that's internet-facing. The sites use one namespace. And because there is only one namespace, DNS again is easier to manage, certificates are easier to manage, client computers still use that single URL. But again, this model brings with it the disadvantage that there'll be proxying involved. Now, regional namespaces, that involves multiple physical sites and multiple namespaces. So you might have a site in New York that has the namespace mail.ny.companyname.com, and then maybe you have another site that is in Florida that has mail.fl.companyname.com. Now, this reduces the need for proxying, but now you have more DNS records and more certificates to worry about. So again, there's pros and cons to each of these options depending on what you want to do. And then, of course, your client computers need to be configured with the appropriate URL, that external URL that's going to get them to their client access server easier. And then another factor is that client computers have to be configured with the proper external URL. And then last here on the list is multiple forests. That's where you might have multiple forests with multiple namespaces. This could involve multiple partner companies that have come together. And so instead of something like mail.newyork.companyname.com, it might be mail.usa.companyname.com and let's say mail.europe.othercompanyname.com. So in those cases, the forests have different domain names altogether, and so the namespaces are going to be different as well. It is a lot to think about depending upon your environment. So there is no one way to do this. It really depends upon what your circumstances are, what your needs are, and the layout really of your physical environment first, so that you can understand where you're going to map out your Exchange servers, and then of course make sure you choose a namespace model and design that matches up with your needs. Now, once you have your namespace design decisions in place, then you can move forward with DNS configuration or configurations, with your digital certificate or certificates, and with your client configurations. So now let's talk for a moment about certificate configuration. Alright, so let's try and boil down the certificate configuration side to this discussion. Ultimately, you secure the traffic between client access servers and between client access servers and clients through secure socket layers. So in order for this to work, there has to be some kind of certificate in place, some kind of trust arrangement, so that the end client knows that the client access server is the right server and that it should be connected to it. Now, you want to make sure that you use proper certificates in a production environment. That's key. There is a self-signed cert used by the client access server when you get started. The client access server and mailbox server have these self-signed certificates, but when it comes to the client access server, you should remove this and go with a certificate assigned by a certificate authority, a CA, on the client access server. Now, why would you want to use a public certificate authority? Well, for one, client computers internally and on the internet already trust the root CA, so certificates can be chained to the root without further configuration. And the public CA provides typically easy to use management services for those certificates. So you can revoke certificates, create new ones. It's usually an easy solution to work with, because they make it as easy as possible. That's not necessarily the case when you're working with an internal certification solution. Now, you can use an internal CA solution. You can set this up, you can configure it, but you'll find it to be more complicated to configure, and it may not be worth the time compared to the little bit of money that you'll spend on a public cert. So it is true, certificates issued by internal CAs, they're free. The cost of implementing and managing a CA, however, but the cost of implementing and managing an internal certificate authority solution, even one from Microsoft, that can be higher than buying certificates from a public CA. It's true. The certificates from a public CA can be quite cheap, and the time that you might spend working with an internal solution might exceed what it would have taken for you to just purchase a few from the public. The other thing is client computers that are not members of the Active Directory domain, they won't automatically trust the root CA for an internal certification solution. So you'll have to add certificates for the trusted root to client machines when it's necessary. So there's extra configuration, there's extra work involved with going with an internal CA. And so that's why I personally recommend, and most folks recommend, that you do go with a public certification authority. Now, when you configure the certificate, you have to think about the certificate names that are going to be used. Much of this depends on how you want persons to access the services on your server. For example, if you use Outlook Web App and you want users to use a URL like https://mail.domainname.com, or let's say you use POP or IMAP and you want them to use the name pop.domainname.com and so forth, all of these names have to be in the certificate. And that will prevent then the end user from getting pop-up messages that say that there's a problem with the certificate. That will prevent the browser address bar from being read and scaring the end user into thinking that there's a problem. It's not necessarily a big deal when you're doing lab work and you're just doing testing and so forth. And you'll see even in the lessons here, sometimes the browser bars will show red because the certificates are not in place. And that's because we're working with lab servers. These are not production servers. But you can certainly see how in a production environment, in a professional environment, you do not want end users to ever see that. Well, the key to that is to make sure that you have your namespaces in order, and when you go for your certificates, you need to make sure you have the proper certificate names listed in the request. One other point about using POP or IMAP, if you do want to use POP or IMAP, those services are set to start manually. So you want to change this and go into services and configure those to be automatic, and then start those services if you plan on using the POP or IMAP solutions. As far as management of POP or IMAP, that's all done through the Exchange Management Shell. And there's really not much you can configure, but there are a few different things that you can configure through the shell. So if you do want to use POP or IMAP, then you certainly want to look at the configuration options from the PowerShell command line. Now, another thing to keep in mind when it comes to certificate names is to make sure if you're going to use AutoDiscover, that also must be in the certificate, the autodiscover.whatever.com. Now, AutoDiscover is very helpful for the end users, especially those who are using mobile devices to connect in, because it helps to configure Outlook and mobile device profiles automatically. So the AutoDiscover has to be in the certificate, and it also has to be part of the DNS configuration as well. As far as the type of certificates that you want to utilize, we've talked about this in the past. There's a lesson in the Exchange 2013 administration course that discusses certificates. And so if this discussion seems a little bit too far along, too advanced, perhaps you'll want to jump back over and get a review of the actual administration side to certificates. At the same time, we're going to demonstrate obtaining a certificate for Spytech Prime, and you'll be able to see the process itself. But in terms of the types of certificates that we want, one of the things you can do is you can go with a separate cert for each name, which is complicated and it's not recommended, and it's really unnecessary. It is an option, and that's why it's listed here, and so it's important when you're thinking of the certification exam that you know all of the possibilities as well as all of the best practice type solutions. So as far as the best option, you can go with a certificate that uses multiple subject alternative names, or SAN certificate, so that all of the names listed are accounted for when clients connect. And that's typically what is used with Exchange, are SAN certificates. They may also have other acronyms or names given to them by the certificate authority, but ultimately they're SAN certificates. So that's what you really want to look for. Now some may say, well, what about a wildcard certificate? You can go with a wildcard certificate like star or asterisk.domainname.com, but the problem here is that not all clients support these, and they're really considered a security issue. That's because the certificate can be used for any server name in the domain. And so if the cert becomes compromised, then the host names for the organization are compromised as well. So again, that's not a recommendation. The SAN certificate is really the best way to go. All right, let's jump over to our Spytech Prime solution here. We are going to just go through the process of requesting the certificate from the certificate authority. In this case, it's GoDaddy. And then we'll go and we'll obtain that certificate and we'll implement the certificate and switch over the services for the cert. So looking at this from a scenario perspective, we are going to jump over to our Exchange server and take a look at the self-signed certificates that we currently have for Spytech Prime. But in wanting to move Spytech Prime from a lab environment into a production environment, but now the next step is to configure Spytech Prime to use a certification authority SAN or UCC certificate from our ISP, which is GoDaddy. So we're going to use GoDaddy as our certification authority. Here's the process that we're going to go through. We're going to use the Exchange Certificate Wizard to obtain a certificate signing request, a CSR. We're going to use that CSR to complete the GoDaddy certificate process. Then we're going to download the certificate from GoDaddy and complete the pending certificate wizard. Then we'll assign the IIS service to the new certificate and demonstrate that it works. Now before we do this, we're going to demonstrate that when we do go to Outlook Web App through our browser, because there is a self-signed certificate, we do get a certification error message. And we'll demonstrate how after we get the certification authority certificate, that error message goes away. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so we're on our Windows Server 2012 Exchange server, and we already have our certificates up here. You can see we're in the Exchange Admin Center under Servers, that's the feature, and we have selected the Certificates tab. Now from here you can see several certificates already exist. If we select these certificates, you can see here, in each case, these are self-signed certificates. You can see that we have a variety of different ones. You can see in this case, this certificate is assigned to IMAP, POP, IIS, and SMTP services. And you can see that this one is assigned to SMTP services. You'll note that these are self-signed certificates. So in our case, what happens with a self-signed certificate? Well, in a lab environment, there's nothing wrong with having self-signed certificates because you're not so concerned about how this looks from a professional perspective. But let's take a look at what this looks like when you try to access a feature like Outlook Web App. Here, if we open up a new tab, and let's say we use the URL that's been established for this. If we go to HTTPS and it's webmail.spytechprime.com Outlook Web App, this is what our people will see. They'll see that there's a problem with the website certificate, and they can click continue to this website. It's not recommended, but they can do it. So they click. They get this big red error thing up at the top, certificate error. Now they can accept the certificate, the self-signed certificate, and they can make this go away. But again, this is not professional. The same is true, as you saw in a previous lesson, when we open up our Outlook on a client, it lets them know, hey, this is going to work for you, but you don't have a valid certificate. It's a self-signed certificate, so yes, it is valid, but it's not a production-oriented certificate. So this is what we see when we're dealing with certificates that are self-signed through the Exchange Admin Center, and they're assigned by default when we install Exchange. So this is why we need to make a change here. We need to get a new certificate and be able to then assign that certificate to our services so that then when folks go to solutions like Outlook Web App or they open up their Outlook, they're not going to see those error messages coming their way. It's just not professional to leave those in a production environment. So, okay, so how do we go about getting a certificate? Well, On the one hand, you have to pay for this certificate through a certificate authority. So in our case, we're using GoDaddy as our certificate authority. They're also the domain registration organization that we used. So it's an easy matchup to go back to them and get our certificate authority certificate. But in order to get that cert, we have to have what they call a CSR. And so the way to do this is we click the plus sign here, and we can get a new Exchange certificate. So now this wizard will create a new certificate, either a self-signed certificate, or it will create a certificate request file, a CRF, that we can then use in order to get our certificate from our certificate authority. So in our case, we already have self-signed certificates. We want to create a request for a certificate from a certification authority. So we click Next, and we'll give it a friendly name. It's always good to make this name as descriptive as possible. So in our case, we'll call it GoDaddy Cert version 1 and click Next. It asks us if we want to request a wildcard certificate, which can be used to secure all subdomains under your root domain with a single certificate. And typically, it's not recommended that you use wildcard certificates with Exchange, not with Modern Exchange anyway. So we'll click Next. And here we want to store the request somewhere so that we can then find it later. We're going to store it on this server. We'll click Next. And now here it asks us to specify the domains that we want to have included in our certificate. So in our case, there are some that are not specified. Here we have Outlook web app when accessed from the internet. If we open this, we might have this be oamail.spytechprime.com and say OK. Here, OA when accessed from the intranet, we can actually change this, because even though this is currently what it uses, we might want to use our webmail and say OK. It's a lot easier for folks to remember webmail than for them to remember POS EX2K1013. So we have these options here. So we have the Outlook address book when accessed from the internet, the Outlook address book when accessed from the intranet. So you can go through and configure all of these different options as far as how to specify it. You see here Exchange Web Services, Exchange Active Sync, Auto Discover. After that, you click Next. All right, and so from here you can see, based upon our selections, the following domains will be included in our certificate. But it's too many, perhaps, or perhaps we don't want to be concerned with the actual server names in our certificates, so we can remove these, and then we're looking at just the names that we're going to be focused on. And you can go back. Remember, you can go back and make changes to your certificates. You can add additional names to your SAN or UCC certificates in order to make sure you have all of the domain names that you need in your Exchange environment. So in our case, we're just going to focus on the intranet and internet Outlook web app mail, and we have our primary domain name here. One thing to note is that you can see this one's bolded. That's because it is, as you can see here, the common name for this domain. You want to select your primary domain name, the root there for the domain, and change that to the common name. And so now you can see that one's bolded. And then we click Next. It asks us for the organization name, the department name, the country or region name, the city, and state. And we're going to use our US credentials for this, even though the company is based fictitiously in the islands in the Caribbean. We're going to use the United States as our base for this certificate. We click Next. We have to save the certificate to a file, and so in this case, we'll put it right at our C drive and click Finish. And now we can see that that certificate request is here, pending request. So once we have the certificate actually from GoDaddy, we can then complete this request. For now, though, let's go take a look at the certificate request. If we open it with Notepad, Here's the certificate request information. Yes, it's supposed to look like that. That might freak you out the first time, but this is what it's supposed to look like, and this is what we're going to paste in to our GoDaddy site in order to get that certificate. So let's open up a new window here. We'll go to our secure socket layer certificates. Here's our SSL certificate. They call it a UCC, but it's also the same as a SAN certificate. And so here, if we click launch, and then we'll click request certificate. Okay, and so here's where we can put in our certificate signing request. What we basically do is we select all of this, select everything, even right to the end new certificate request. Right click, click copy, come back over here, paste it in. We'll leave the default third-party or dedicated server. That's where the certificate is going to be hosted. We don't have to add any additional information. The certificate issuing organization is GoDaddy. We click next. All right, and so here we can see our domain name. We can see all of the information is correct. Third-party hosting, GoDaddy is the certificate issuing organization. Here are our subject alternative names. Now, if we did not choose Spytech Prime to be the common name, you'll note that if you're doing this in your environments, production or lab, and let's say one of these other names is here for the domain name and Spytech Prime is down here, well, that's because you did not choose it as the common name that we did earlier in the wizard when you set up the certificate request. So that's just a little glitch. You can always just redo it and get the domain name as the root domain for your organization. So, okay, we're good to go. We click next. It says you're through. Your certificate will be issued shortly. So we click finished, and the status is pending. So we'll take a little break and we'll come back and we will check to see when the status is no longer pending and when we can download the certificate, and then we can import that certificate into our Exchange server. And you can see that our status is now current. We can select the certificate and then choose the download option. Here it says select your server type. Notice it doesn't give us Exchange 2013 just yet. That's okay though. We'll choose Exchange 2010 and we'll click download. Let's open up the zip file. And you can see here two different certificates. This is the one that we need to import into our Exchange server. This certificate is also important. It's an intermediate certificate. It's a way of providing proof that GoDaddy is our go-between for our certificate authority. So we're not going to focus on this just yet. We'll just focus on getting our Exchange site up and running. We'll take both of these and we'll copy them out of their zip file. We'll drop it right here at the C drive. That'll just make it easier when we finish the Exchange certificate portion when we jump back over to the Exchange server. So at this point, we're good to go. Let's jump back over to our Exchange Admin Center. All right, and you can see here that we have our GoDaddy cert that's pending request. We can complete the request. To do that, we have to point off to the certificate. So you'll recall we put it right here. There it is. So we'll put in the UNC path. And now we can see our GoDaddy certificate is considered valid. It expires in a year from now, but currently there are no services that have been assigned. But you can see this is not a self-signed certificate. So we have the certificate, but we haven't assigned any services over to it. So to do that, if we just double-click the cert and we go to Services, here we can select the services that we want to assign. So for the sake of our demonstration here, we'll just assign the IIS service to it for now, and we'll leave these other services off of the selection. We can select them at any time. We can come back and make changes to this. We'll click Save. And now we go back over to Outlook Web App. Let's just close this one out. Open up a new Outlook Web App. And notice we get no error when it comes to the certificate. Everything's still clear up here. We can log in without a problem. And as you can see, we're good to go. We no longer have any certificate issues. We have no more red boxes up in here, no certificate errors. So everything is working just fine. If we go back to certificates, we could obviously take this certificate and now apply it to SMTP services, or really any of the other services that we see being handled by our self-signed certificates. We can now move them over to the valid certificate. All right, let's jump back over to our slides and let's have a discussion of authentication settings. All right, so let's talk about authentication settings for a moment. This is not really connected to certificates or connected to DNS or namespaces. It's really a separate subject, but it's listed under these objectives, and we can see why, because it's basically connected to the same set of settings when you look at your virtual directories, and making the changes to your authentication occurs there. So we'll take a look at this in a moment. You'll see what I mean as far as the connection between the concepts. So basically, in addition to certification configuration, you can adjust authentication options as well. So certification relates to secure socket layers, it relates to security, and authentication also relates to security. Now, the options for authentication include integrated Windows authentication, and so with something like a single internet accessible client access server for all of your sites, you want to make sure that you enable Windows integrated authentication on any of the servers that are not internet accessible. And so you might use, let's say, forms-based authentication for the external facing or outward facing Outlook Web App server. But on your internal CAS servers, you want to configure those to allow for integrated Windows authentication. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, there's also digest authentication. This secures passwords by transmitting these passwords as a hash value over the network. So in order to use this, the users, the end users, they have to have an account that is an Active Directory account. Then there's basic authentication. Now this transmits passwords, but it doesn't encrypt them. So it encrypts them in clear text over the network. So if you're going to use basic authentication, you should also use secure socket layer encryption. Basic authentication is typically supported by most clients. So that's one positive thing to using basic authentication, is that you have clients that can use it no matter what client. But it's good to note, and it's pointed out by Microsoft, that the single sign-on option is not supported. So your workstation credentials or network credentials are not passed over basic authentication. So if you're going to use forms-based authentication, then you need to remember to use integrated Windows authentication as well. And that is the last one, forms-based authentication. So forms-based authentication is really just for Outlook Web App and for the Exchange Admin Center for those who use the ECP. Now, when it comes to forms-based authentication, really the nice thing about this is that it provides the web-based login for you to log in through for Outlook Web App or for EAC. And throughout this course, we've used forms-based authentication. The one thing you don't want to do, and this is a real serious warning, you do not want to mess up your authentication methods. And that's especially true when it comes to the Exchange Admin Center. Now, let me tell you why. If you adjust the settings for authentication and something goes wrong, and you're not able to access the Exchange Admin Center again, the ECP site, the problem there is that you won't be able to fix it. Now you might say, well, can I go to IIS and can I adjust the settings there and get my authentication settings back through the virtual directories in there? Well, yes, technically you can, but you're talking about a real nightmare. So be real careful about the changes that you make to the authentication, especially with regard to your ECP. Now, one of the really nice things about forms-based authentication, and something that we've obviously seen here, is that it creates a logon web page for Outlook Web App as well as the EAC. And there are changes that you can make to that page. You can modify the login page, you can make it more specific to your organization. But in our case here, throughout the course, we haven't messed with it, we've just used the default. Now, forms-based authentication does use basic authentication. But as we just mentioned, it requires the use of SSL, which will then encrypt the credentials as they're transmitted over the network. One of the things to keep in mind is that forms-based authentication is enabled by default. But when it comes to using CAS servers that are non-internet facing on the inside, you want to change the configuration to Windows Integrated Authentication. And that's because forms-based authentication also does not support single sign-on. Let's jump over to our server and let's take a look at the authentication mechanisms here and how you might adjust these for your different virtual directories. Alright, so here we are in the Exchange Admin Center under the Servers feature, and you can see we're in the Virtual Directories tab, which is right next to Certificates. So we look at this and we say, alright, if we look at the different options for virtual directories, we have Auto Discover, ECP, which is our Exchange Admin Center itself, EWS, Microsoft Server ActiveSync, OAB for the offline address book, Outlook Web App, and PowerShell. And these are not all the same, actually. Here, if we look at PowerShell, for example, we can see that on the General tab we have internal and external URL settings. So if we wanted to access PowerShell from an external side, we'd want to make sure that we put in the proper external URL. And if we look at authentication, we see that we have the options Integrated Windows Authentication and Basic Authentication. It's typically best not to mess around with the PowerShell settings. The Outlook Web App is important. If we open this up, you can see here we need to provide the internal and external URL that will be utilized when we configure the namespaces. So depending on whether or not you're going with split DNS or not, you might use the same URL in both, or you might go with different URLs for each one. And then we have authentication here, which, as you can see by default, this CAS server uses forms-based authentication, and we can see the logon format. We can change this if we want, or we can change to use one of the more standard authentication methods. So again, it just depends on what we're looking for. In this case, we can use forms-based authentication and leave it, or if we had specific requirements to do otherwise, we could change it to one of these others. Before making changes of this sort, you want to make sure that you really know what you're doing and make sure that the end users will be prepared for the changes that come their way, because it will be a difference between the forms-based authentication and their integrated or digest authentication or basic authentication methods. Before making changes here, you do want to make sure that you know what you're doing, especially when it comes to the control panel, or rather Exchange Admin Center, because the settings here, if you make changes to these settings, it will affect whether or not you can access your Exchange Admin Center. And the connection here, notice this, it says the Exchange Control Panel, as you can see, or the EAC. That's why I called it that earlier, because it actually was the Exchange Control Panel, and it's ECP in the URL. So this just hasn't been updated to the Exchange Admin Center yet. But the ECP uses the same sign-in format as Outlook Web App. So it's important to note that there is a connection between the changes you make for ECP and the changes you make for OA. And so you want to make sure that you're in sync. If you're going to go one way or another, make sure the two are synchronized as far as the authentication method that you choose. Alright, let's jump back over to our slides and let's close out the lesson. So in this lesson, we reviewed the value of good namespace design and how that connects back to DNS configuration and SSL certificate requests. When it comes to SpyTech Prime, we obtained and configured a CA-approved SSL certificate, and then we assigned services to it. We also discussed different authentication options. As far as additional research for this lesson, most of it is focused around namespace understanding and design. So the first one is understanding client access server namespaces. The second is setting up single namespace in Exchange 2013. And then we have Robert's Rules of Exchange Namespace Planning. So we hope you found this informative. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.